We have been on the infertility journey for about 7 years, and then 5 of those years we've been receiving treatment.
7 years of trying, 5 of those utilizing fertility treatment. Today's episode is a demonstration of what we mean when we talk about infertility and fertility treatment being complex and draining. Michelle and her husband Alex have been through a lot, so today we're going to unpack all of it and see what we can learn. I'm Dan Bulger with Progyny, and this is Infertility. We have a lot to cover today, so let's dive right in.
My name is Michelle Meyer. My husband and I live in Los Angeles. We've lived here since 2009. We're actually both from small towns in Northern California. For work, I am a corporate recruiter with Wayfair, the e-commerce brand, the place you can get all of your home furnishings at. I know most people know that, but just in case they didn't. We've been trying to start a family for the past 7 years. So I'm about to be 37. And we've had infertility treatments for 5 of them. I definitely, and most people would say this, I did not think we'd have a problem getting pregnant. I've never had trouble with my cycles. I've always had really regular periods. I have all the right signs that I'm ovulating, all of that. Although, again, I didn't know that those were really ovulation signs until I was 30. So it was a shock when we weren't pregnant after the first couple of years of trying.
This is something we say a lot here, so if you're currently binging through a bunch of our episodes, I apologize for this repetition, but the general rule of thumb for those who are trying is to seek help from a fertility doctor after trying for about a year. That's for those who are younger than 35, and for those who are 35 and older, should see a doctor sooner, about 6 months. But that's not a real rule, it's a rule of thumb. You can see a doctor when you feel you need to see a doctor. But that's not exactly common knowledge, so Michelle didn't know that. For her, it made sense to chat with her OBGYN. And as it turned out, she needed a new OB at this time anyway, so she figured she could just find one who had a fertility focus.
I had to find a new doctor. And so when I had started researching a new doctor, I was looking for a doctor who also did IUIs, because from my own research, I had found that besides doing a semen analysis, that was kind of the first step that they usually recommend. We started with my husband doing the semen analysis first, and then I did some of the initial blood tests with her, and then his results had come back with low motility and then not the highest numbers. So that's when she diagnosed him with male infertility, and then all the tests she ran on me seemed really great. I don't want to say I looked perfect on paper, but I looked pretty good on paper. She flagged for me was that my TSH was a little high, and to be pregnant, most OBGYNs and then fertility doctors will want your TSH 2.5 and below for pregnancy. So she put me on levothyroxine for my thyroid right away. And then we had our first IUI with her.
Let's put a pin in this thyroid issue as it comes into play much later in the story. But for now, they went ahead with an IUI. And when that didn't work, they tried 2 more rounds of IUI before deciding that it was time to see a fertility specialist.
Again, we ran the semen analysis. We diagnosed my husband with male factor infertility as well. And then I did more of my full blood panel with them. And for the most part, everything looked pretty good. Again, my TSH was a little off. But we kind of keep an eye on that. And then she recommended to do one more IUI with her. And we made it a medicated cycle with Clomid, which we hadn't tried before. And I know a lot of people try medicated right off the bat, but we did not do that. And so after that failed, we really just did not want to move forward with IUI. I mean, the chances seem so slim. And so, I mean, even looking back on it, I wish we didn't waste the time or money, but if you don't try, how do you know if it wouldn't work? And then the next steps were IVF. And so late in 2019, 2018 is when we moved into deciding to officially move forward with IVF.
Yes, IVF has significantly better success rates than IUI. But of course, everyone doesn't just run right to IVF all the time, mostly because IVF is significantly more expensive than IUI.
Even going into a fertility clinic and my husband and I having these conversations like, oh, like what would we ever do if we had to do IVF? I don't think we could afford it. I mean, we didn't have that big of a saving. So that's always a difficult conversation to have, but both of us want kids so bad. So when it came down to that, kind of being the next step, we had to figure out how to make it happen. Neither myself or my husband had infertility coverage through our work. And at the time we were on his insurance and I was working for a nonprofit. So they definitely did not have any infertility coverage. And so after we had the conversation with our doctor on what the cost looked like, we had some savings. So that covered our first initial egg retrieval round. And then we had to take out a personal loan, which we're still paying off. And then, throughout the whole process, we have maxed out 2 credit cards. And then before our 4th egg retrieval, which was at the end of 2021, we were completely out of funds. And my sister actually started a GoFundMe for us, and that allowed us to have our 4th egg retrieval. And then at that point, we were $75,000 to $85,000 out of pocket, obviously still paying off all of the debt we had around it. And we still have around it.
I wish I could say that it's wildly unusual to spend so much out of pocket for fertility treatment, but sadly, this is a story I've heard before. Now, spoiler here for later in the story, Michelle ends up with a company, Wayfair, that offers fertility benefits through Progyny, and it really changes everything. But as you'll hear, she and her husband went through the ringer first.
We decided we would start in January 2020. And then my first couple of cycles, so usually when you start the IVF process, they'll put you on birth control. They kind of settle your system down. And it's also an easier way for them to know exactly when everything is going to start for you. But my body does not like to respond to some of those hormones. So we did not get to start an actual cycle until March 2020. And when we figured out that I wasn't responding to the other hormones to kind of stop everything, my doctor said, okay, we're going to just follow your natural cycle. That's really when we started our stim. So like our stimulation medications to make everything start happening. And then as we all know, March 2020, what happened? COVID hit. So for everyone in the infertility community, that was really nerve-wracking and scary. And we barely made the cutoff of not having our cycle canceled. So super thankful we got to complete that. We actually completed it like the week they decided to then shut down the clinic while they figured out, what the protocols were moving forward. So we had that egg retrieval. The breakdown of my cycle is that we got 17 eggs, but only 11 of those were mature. And then of those 11, 8 fertilized. And then you have to wait, 5 to 6 days to see which embryo make it to blastocyst. And for us, only 1 embryo made it to blast. And then we decided, okay, yes, we want to get this tested. And it did come back normal.
One healthy embryo is very good news, but there's no guarantee that even a healthy embryo will successfully implant and lead to a baby. And even in the case that it does, well, what if you want a second baby down the road? So Michelle and Alex decided to do what many do, which is keep that embryo frozen and do another stim cycle to try to get more embryos. Now, the COVID-related clinic closures meant there was going to be a bit of a wait.
During that wait is when I started to see an acupuncturist weekly. And then I really went back onto being pretty strict on my diet.
But acupuncture and a more strict diet weren't the only changes for this second stim cycle.
We also with this stimulation cycle, decided to lower one of my medications. So the medication is called Gonal-F, and then for some people it's called Follistin. So she did this in hopes that it would allow my follicles to grow more in sync at a slower pace. And then she said, okay, I might just be on that medication for longer. So she was trying to figure out, okay, how do we get more mature eggs out of each egg retrieval? And so this is, one of the things she came up with. And the funny thing is that my body actually reacted the same way to the 150 as it had to the 300, but we did get more mature eggs. So, and I didn't have to be on it longer. So my body responds really well to the medication.
When making these episodes, we usually record with our guests for about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and then we cut the episode down to be 20 to 40 minutes. So there's always this give and take on what to keep and what to summarize with a beautiful narration like this one. We wanted to keep the part about the new protocol, not to signify that everyone should use lower doses of Gonal-F for their IVF treatment, but to highlight how IVF and the treatment protocol will work best when it's catered to a person's individual body. This is why it's so important to find the right doctor. You'll need a doctor or a clinic that has experience with whatever it is that you're experiencing. That being said, this new protocol resulted in 2 healthy embryos, so they now had 3 healthy embryos, and they were ready to transfer.
Basically, the beginning of September, we said, okay, let's move to transfer, but we actually did not end up getting to transfer until February. And part of that was because before every transfer, you do a saline ultrasound. They check your cavity, your uterus, to see if it all looks smooth, it all looks good. So when I had my first saline ultrasound, the doctor saw a small polyp. So then I was put under to have a hysteroscopy so that she could remove it. I also retested my TSH, and it was very high. And so they recommended just upping my levothyroxine. However, here's another time I had to advocate for myself. I asked what other tests there are, what could be causing this. I know estrogen plays a part with your TSH, but I requested to have a full thyroid panel, and that includes an antibody test. And guess what? That came back positive, which meant I had Hashimoto's.
Hashimoto's is an autoimmune disorder which affects the thyroid gland. Remember I said we'd get back to the thyroid numbers? That was about this.
So then I wanted to be on medications to get my levels down. My endocrinologist is great though, because she's like, it takes about 4 weeks to see your levels come out in a blood test. But she has assured me time and time again that even if it does not say it, if you're upping your levels, your body is working. It is working. So she's great to lean on for those conversations. She knows what's happening.
Okay, so she worked with her endocrinologist on the Hashimoto's and began preparing for a transfer. Michelle and her doctor agreed that a natural FET cycle made sense for her.
So we were able to start our first transfer cycle February 2021. They were following my natural cycle. So when I started my period, I went in. And then because we were doing a natural cycle, with a trigger. And then I did start supplemental medication or hormones just a couple of days before my transfer. So a lot of people who don't follow a natural cycle, they're starting medications a little bit further back from transfer. But since we were following my natural cycle and my lining didn't have problems growing and all of that looked okay, I only had supplemental hormones, just again, a couple of days before transfer.
Okay, so everything seemed to line up and Michelle went in for her first embryo transfer. Then she and Alex waited for the results until time came for her to go in for her blood pregnancy test.
I went in for our beta, and then that evening we got a call from our doctor telling us we were pregnant. It was very exciting. It's the first time, we've ever been pregnant. We cried right away. And then she told me what my beta was, and I said, oh, that's really weird because they did release my lab to my portal, and it's a different number. And so she was like, that's strange. I'm really confused. Let me call you back. I need to figure this out. So we waited. It was like 10 minutes later. She called us back. Her voice was very shaky. And she told us that the clinic had given her the wrong results. So there was another patient with my same initials that had a beta test on the same day who was pregnant, and we weren't. So that was super tough. Like, we were on such a high. Again, we were like, wow, this is our first transfer. This is the first time we've been pregnant. And then to have them say, actually, it was a mistake. I mean, there were very lows, there were a lot of lows to that evening because of that. It's like, we had waited years to just have that, and then it was just taken away. And so that was really hard. And there was just, I don't know, I still have, trauma from that. And I'm, even with my newer clinic, I'm always like, nope, is this the right Michelle? I'm double checking. I'm making sure that they know. And I think that through this whole process, that's something that it will always be top of mind, because I just feel like those are the worst results to mix up.
Doctors are human, and their offices are filled with humans, and as we know, humans can make the occasional mistake. That being said, this is a very emotionally traumatic mistake for a fertility clinic to make. But she still had another embryo to transfer, so after some time, they did a second embryo transfer.
I ended up actually getting a positive beta, and it was very exciting because now this was officially our first pregnancy. And we took a test, we took a picture. We had just never had a test say, yes, you're pregnant. It was very exciting. And then the only thing that was not great is that the beta came back at 41. And for your first beta, everybody will say, a beta number does not really matter. It just matters that it's doubling when it should. So our numbers came back at 41. Usually clinics on your first beta want to see it over 100. And then 2 days later, I went back, had a test, and it had only gone up to 49. So each time you have a test, they want it doubled. Ours had not doubled, but it was still rising. They call this slow rising HCG. And since it was still rising a little bit, our doctor just wanted to monitor it. So 2 days later, I went back, and then my results were at 79. So it was getting a little better. It's still slow rising. And then because it hadn't stopped or just dropped, our doctor didn't want to count anything out. So we went in for our first ultrasound at 5.5 weeks. And so during this, they're looking for a yolk and a gestational sac, and ours was showing that. So we have some hope. We're like, yes, maybe this is going to be our little miracle. And then we went back for our 6 weeks, and we saw, a small flicker of a heartbeat, which was really cool. And then we went back for our 7.5 week appointment, and that's when we found out that it had stopped growing and there was no longer a heartbeat. It's hard to be excited when you get that positive, because that it can stop, at any time. It's just different. The process is different.
As you can imagine, this was a very difficult time.
I got pretty low. It does take a while for your body to come back after that. So it's usually like 4 to 8 weeks until you get a period. And after that miscarriage, we decided if we could, we would do another egg retrieval, which would be our 4th egg retrieval.
Moving on to another cycle meant another financial challenge, and the couple was out of funds for IVF.
So at this point, actually, my younger sister, I'm really close with her. She started a GoFundMe for us, which was very helpful. And I don't know if you've ever had a GoFundMe. It's really hard. It's really hard to have a GoFundMe. I think it's so helpful, but it's hard to be like you're already, sharing your story, but it's hard to say, yes, we do need this help and thank you so much.
And while funds were being raised from friends and family, Michelle started thinking about changing clinics. She wanted to make clear that she was very fond of her doctor, but after going through so much with this clinic, she decided it was time to look for someplace new. And her new doctor had some new ideas.
We would use a couple of different medications. We would keep my Gonal F at the lower dosage. She also recommended that we try an autoimmune protocol for transfers. So a lot of clinics will just do this automatically, but some clinics don't. And so she thought, okay, let's try this. So she also looked at all my past tests and my history. We ran all of the blood panels again. And she did a couple of, she did a full autoimmune workup. She just did a couple of other blood tests you can do. But rerunning these was great because we found out that I actually did have an MTHFR gene mutation. And my last clinic, I had this test, but it didn't flag and it didn't say I had it. And I actually do. And what that means is that my body does not process folate or folic acid properly. So it doesn't absorb it. And that's a very important supplement to have when you're pregnant. It helps with a lot of development of a baby. So I have to take a different kind of folate.
With funds from the GoFundMe her sister put together for them, and a new doctor, clinic, and protocol, they moved ahead with another egg retrieval round. And this round went better than the previous, resulting in 5 blastocysts. It was around this time that they got the Progyny benefit, which means they no longer needed to take out loans or raise money for the remaining treatment. They moved forward with a transfer right away, choosing not to do PGT testing this time because of the previous failed transfers. And this time it resulted in a positive pregnancy test.
We got to our 7th week ultrasound and we were so nervous just because when we lost our first pregnancy. And so we went in and unfortunately the doctor could not find the heartbeat. So like devastation once again, and it's around this 7 week. And it's this miscarriage, because they weren't tested embryos. So again, I decided to have a DNC, but we decided to test the tissue and it came back abnormal. So this baby would have miscarried in anyone. And it really sucked, but it also made me feel a little better knowing that it wasn't something my body was doing.
Unfortunately, the following transfer also didn't work out as well. That's 4 transfers that haven't resulted in a baby at this point, and so Michelle did some research and asked her doctor about trying a fresh transfer instead of a frozen transfer. And quick backstory here is that the standard practice these days is to freeze the embryos prior to transfer. This way there's time to allow the body to return to normal after all of the stim medications, then prepare the body for transfer, thaw an embryo, and transfer an embryo at that point. But Michelle wasn't having a standard experience, so trying something different was certainly worth thinking about.
My doctor made a plan and said, okay, we can try this fresh transfer or we can go into trying for a fresh transfer. If it doesn't work, we'll freeze. But she did a very low dosage stem cycle to try to keep all of my hormones low. And then going into it under the impression that we're very much trying for quality over quantity of eggs and that she wasn't going to, push me to get the highest amount of eggs. So that's also nerve-wracking as well, right? You're like, okay, I'm used to getting 20 eggs, but now I might get 5.
The retrieval yielded a decent number of eggs and a couple of embryos. And then they went right into the fresh transfer. But this fresh transfer didn't lead to a pregnancy.
After that, we're just kind of at a loss. Let's do a hysteroscopy, see if anything's going on, see if there's infection. And so we did a hysteroscopy, and it turns out I did have an infection. She said that that's why our transfer number 4 and 5 could have failed. So now I have that in my head to, if I ever have a miscarriage, so the infection was most likely from my miscarriage. So if I ever have a miscarriage before I do any other transfers, I'll request a hysteroscopy.
At this point, they needed a break. Who wouldn't? They had done 5 retrieval rounds and 5 transfers. I think it's important to know that they took this break, as it's important to know that it's okay to take a break. Mental and physical health is extremely important. Now, earlier on, they had an endometrial biopsy with a previous clinic, and Michelle thought it was to test for endometriosis, but this doctor wasn't able to find those test results.
He said, some of the results from your cycle just align so much with people who have had endometriosis and, the embryo quality and the embryo fall off. And are you sure you had this? And so I went back through my files. I couldn't find them. And I went back to my old doctor and clinic, and I found out I had actually not been tested for endometriosis. I had been tested for endometriotitis, which is completely different. And to somebody who's not a doctor and not in the field, you just see endo and you're thinking it's the same.
I can't imagine how frustrating that was. But it did lead to a new test. She did a test called a Receptiva test with this new doctor. And while these tests aren't perfect, it came back as positive for endometriosis. With the new diagnosis in hand, they moved ahead, again with a different protocol.
We were hoping to do another cycle at the end of this year, moving into that. However, one of the treatments for endometriosis is to go on Lupron depot for a couple months, and depending on your clinic or your situation, it just can be different. My doctor is recommending Lupron depot for 2 months, and then that's 2 injections once a month, so they last 30 days. So I had my first on November 2nd, and then I'll have my second Lupron depot shot on December 2nd, and then most likely between December 29th and January 4th, I'll go in for an ultrasound, and then they'll decide when they want to start my stimulation meds.
So that was the plan, and that was actually where Michelle was when we first spoke to her. Sometimes we move ahead, edit, and produce these episodes as it is and allow it to be open-ended. We think there's real value there, but something about this one made us need to know more. Maybe it's just how much they had been through to that point. So, just recently, we recorded another call to find out how things proceeded from there.
First month on Lupron depot, not too bad. Second month, oh my gosh, I had hot flashes every 20 minutes, 24/7.
It was an interesting couple of months, but finally they were ready to move forward, and after another round of stimming, it was time for their 6th egg retrieval. This one went similar to the previous cycle, double-digit eggs, double-digit fertilized, and then finally a couple reached day 5 blastocyst. She mentioned 2 more reached blast on day 6, and those were frozen for future efforts. Side note, both of those were PGTA tested and both came back normal, which means the couple has some options moving forward. But they moved ahead with a fresh transfer, and
I just really didn't think it worked. I got home from lunch with friends. Husband was in the shower. I was like, I'm just going to test. I'm going to test. I need to know. And I tested it, and then he got so nervous. He's like, wait, you're doing that? Wait, you did this? And then we flipped it over, and there was a line. It was super exciting, but also we were like, uh-oh. Now the more waiting and anxiety and all of that's there, and because it wasn't a tested embryo, I was just like, I'm not going to be okay until 12 weeks.
A positive pregnancy test. Now, they've been here before, so you can understand their trepidation. But the blood test confirmed it, the beta levels doubled, as hoped, and things just kept progressing. And at the time of this call, she was 16 weeks pregnant.
Now we can get more excited. Let's try to celebrate the time we're having. We found out that we're having a boy, which obviously we didn't care what we were having. It was just exciting to find out. Trying to, live in the moment more. And it's really hard, but also we're really excited. I already have a friend who's set a date for one of the baby showers that she wants to have for me, which is really nice. But I'm like, oh my gosh, am I getting ahead of myself? But then I think, oh shoot, I only have 5 months left, or a little over 5 months. I don't know, which seems like it goes by fast. But yeah, so far, good news for our 6th retrieval and 6th transfer.
That back and forth you heard is normal. It's also quite understandable. When going through a long, arduous fertility journey like the one Michelle just shared, it's only natural for any optimism to be cautious optimism. She's experienced too many setbacks to be comfortable just yet. But that being said, they've come a long way, and celebration is due. Now, one more thing before we wrap up. As I mentioned earlier, Michelle's journey involved not having Progyny coverage and then having Progyny coverage. And clearly there's a big difference there. This story was very involved, so we didn't really have time to dive into the benefit stuff this time. But I just want to note that the first half of this story involved a lot of talk about funding and financing and complications with the clinic and other frustrations. The second half of this episode has been all about medical decisions and getting to a pregnancy. That's the power of a comprehensive and supportive benefit that works with the nation's best doctors. So, of course, Progyny is wonderful, but Michelle wouldn't have access to it without her employer, Wayfair, choosing to offer it to their employees.
I think without this benefit, we wouldn't have been able to move forward without having the benefit. So when I was interviewing for different positions and with different companies, that was something I was asking as well. And I love that Wayfair was so open to talk about the benefits. I know there's stigma around like being a mother or even being a father in the workplace, but Wayfair is really great at celebrating people who want to have families. So Progyny at Wayfair is just an amazing benefit and something that we were looking for.
I want to thank Michelle for sharing her experiences with us here today. And I want to thank Wayfair for everything they are doing for their people. I also want to thank you for listening. If you enjoy this show, please don't hesitate to leave a comment or a rating. They really make a difference. You can follow This Is Infertility on Instagram at This Is Infertility Podcast, and you can follow Progyny on Instagram at Progyny Inc. This Is Infertility is brought to you by Progyny, Smarter Fertility Benefits. Please remember this podcast is not intended to substitute for the personalized expert advice of your physician. I'm Dan Bulger, and this is Infertility.